Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to show you different watercolor techniques, so go ahead and enjoy. So we begin with water first. In this method, I'm adding water to the paper first. I'm using a water brush pen. After adding enough water, you decide how much you want to add. It depends on the paper and the effects that you want to get. Then you take your watercolor and lightly tap onto that water and your watercolor will spread. So I like using this method for abstracts. So you have to make sure that the paper is wet enough for the paint to spread. If the water is drying, it won't spread just as well as it should. So you can use multiple colors or a single color or however you want to. You have to keep adding water if you live in a very dry place and the water keeps drying quick. The next method I'm using watercolor directly. So I'm using a watercolor brush and I'm using the watercolor directly from the watercolor cakes or the watercolor tubes. You add water onto the brush and then you mix the paint that you want and then apply it to the surface. I have not added any water before doing this to the paper. So this is very useful to create a wash if you want to apply watercolor to a large area. This is the best way to do it. Next, I'm using a tissue. This method, I add the watercolor first, or you could also use the first method. And once I add the entire area with whatever color that I want, make sure it is still wet, and then I use a tissue to pull out some of the paint that is on the surface, on the paper. So this method I use when I'm creating clouds or if I want to create certain textures. So this is tissue actually pulls out paint very well. The next method is splatter. I'm taking enough paint with enough water onto the brush and just lightly tapping onto the brush to create these splatters. This method that I'm doing is also a kind of a splatter, but I'm using a straw to blow it so it creates that kind of an effect. So remember, the amount of water that you take is what makes a difference. So here I'm starting off with salt water. It's almost the same method that I used first in the first method, but I've added salt to the water. And you see how the paint spreads onto the salt water. It spreads a lot more than it did in the first method. So I really like creating this. This is kind of like alcohol, inks and all that, the way it reacts when you're painting with acrylics. If you've ever painted with alcohol, you'll know what I mean. You could also use alcohol. That creates a different effect. Only make sure you let this dry. I made that mistake just for the sake of this tutorial. I didn't let it dry fast enough. So next I'm starting with masking fluid. This is an essential if you're working with watercolors, if you want to mask a certain area and want it to remain white. So make sure you let the masking fluid dry and then apply the rest of the paint on top of it. I do have videos on how to use masking fluid, you can check that out. So once you apply the watercolor on top of this, make sure the watercolor dries as well. You don't want to pull out the masking fluid that is dried while your paper is still wet, or it might pull out part of your paper. And also make sure you're using a good quality paper when you are using masking fluid. Try it out first before you directly put it onto your final piece and then regret it. Slowly pull out the masking fluid. It's almost like glue, so you just have to pull it out, and there you have it. These are the salt water effects that I'm showing you. Anyway, now I'm starting with just water. I'm gonna add salt later. So this is plain water that I'm adding, like in the first method, and I'm adding a lot of paint. So once I've added the paint, I'm gonna drop a bit of salt onto it. Now I'm adding the salt, and you see it clumps together and creates a different effect. You might want to give it a try. Now we're moving on to different media. So I've already applied some watercolor onto the paper, and I'm going over it with pastel pencils. So this is to show you all the different kinds of things you can use on top of watercolors. So pastels work very well. Make sure you use good paper. Now I'm using colored pencil. This is Polychromos, and even that works very well over watercolor. If you're wanting to paint with Polychromos, create a piece with Polychromos, and you don't want to cover the entire surface, you might want to try considering watercolor as a background. Next, I'm using Inktense by Derwent. I'm using the block directly to apply onto the paper, and then using water to spread it. You can also use it like you use watercolor cakes. So it comes into forms, blocks and pencils, so you could use either. Now I'm just showing you various media that you could use over watercolor. These are different pens, Tombow calligraphy pen and white gel pen. You could use Pigma brush pens. You could use Faber-Castell markers. Just try out different things. You don't have to stick to traditional methods. You can also use micron pens to create certain border effects, certain outlining. Just try on different things and you'll see you'll love the effects. Next, I'm showing you watercolor pencils. This is also another medium you could use if you're working with watercolors. Watercolor pencils are a great way to create lines and certain finer details. I do have a video where I explain different ways to use watercolor pencils. I'll have the link in the description below so you can check that out. This next method that I'm using is by adding a lot of watercolor onto the surface with a lot of water and then adding plastic wrap over it, so it creates those weird lines, those weird effects, you have to try it out to experiment with it. And make sure you do have a lot of water under the surface, and make sure you let it dry very well. So these were all the different kinds of methods that you could use watercolor in. I'm sure there are a lot more ways, but these are all I do. And thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned for more videos every week. You will have one more video come up this week because I didn't upload one last week. So thank you so much for watching.